Emma Yang lived with her mother in a small town in northern Kentucky. Their family wasn't wealthy, and therefore the mother and daughter only felt that fate had treated them unfairly. Deborah Yang's husband died 10 years ago, so the woman ended up having to take care of her daughter on her own. She had to go through a lot before she could finally get used to being a single mother. Emma could still remember the time when she had to go to school wearing rags. Children are often cruel, and little Emma's classmates were no exception. It was unbearably painful to endure their ridicule, but the girl accepted all the trials that fell to her lot with incredible humility. However, when Emma grew up, she was surprised to realize that it wasn't only the family's poverty that made other people in town dislike them. There was something else too, something strange and not entirely clear to Emma. Apparently, it was something about the past of the Yang family. Unfortunately, no matter how much Emma tried to get her mother to share the reason for the townspeople's contemptuous attitude towards them, she never succeeded in finding out the truth. Deborah Yang didn't like to talk about her past and nipped in the bud any of her daughter's attempts to learn anything about it. Time went on. Emma grew up, but she never left her parents' house, choosing to stay and help her mother run their small farm. Despite the fact that their land was believed to be rather fertile, the Yang family always had a rather modest harvest. Emma felt that it wasn't just the locals, but even the land itself that didn't like them. Sure, no one explicitly said anything to Emma or her mother, but they didn't really need to. Their attitude was all too obvious. At some point, tired of the never-ending failures, the young woman started blaming their elderly neighbor for everything, as everyone in the town considered her a witch. For as long as Emma could remember, Penelope Scott had been living alone. "Mom, why does Mrs. Scott always live alone? Is she a recluse?" Emma asked once. "I don't know, honey. Rumor has it that she's a witch, but I don't believe that's true. She's simply unsocial, so they started disliking her, just like us," Deborah Yang answered with a sad sigh. Of course, that answer didn't entirely satisfy Emma. The young woman was pretty much ready to believe that their neighbor really was a witch. Of course, whenever she came across Penelope Scott, she said hello to the old woman, but she always was afraid to look into her eyes. What if she really is a witch? She'll look at me with her gray eyes and I'll end up being miserable. Although I'm already miserable as it is, Emma thought. Since Deborah had her daughter at a fairly mature age, she looked like her grandmother more than her mother. On top of that, she got sick quite often, which couldn't but leave its mark on the appearance of the 55-year-old woman. This was one of the reasons why Emma was afraid to leave her mother alone and refused to move to a bigger city. "You shouldn't spend all your free time with me, dear. You should start thinking about yourself," Deborah Yang kept telling her daughter. "Don't worry, Mom, I still have time for all of it, to start a family and find a better job," Emma said. At that moment, the young woman didn't even know that very soon her life would change completely. Since there weren't many jobs in their town, Emma was happy to work as a postwoman after the person who previously held this position decided to quit. The young woman liked her job. Emma enjoyed spending most of her time in the fresh air, as well as getting to chat with the townspeople. It just so happened that she even met her boyfriend at work. It was during her visit to Priscilla Brown, who was waiting for her grandson to come in from the city. Howard Brown turned out to be a tall, handsome man who had broken many hearts by that time and was considered a ladies' man by the locals. Emma was rather pretty, which didn't go unnoticed by the young man. The young people got to talking and felt a strong attraction towards each other literally minutes after they first met. Howard was joking nonstop, and Emma laughed contagiously every time the man deliberately changed his voice, pretending to be someone famous. The relationship between the rich young man and the poor woman developed so suddenly and came as a surprise to them both. Howard was great at courting women, so he quickly turned Emma's head. The naive young woman truly believed in the sincerity of the young man's feelings and hoped that their relationship had a future. Their relationship was so passionate that the young people didn't pay any attention to the people around them and behaved as if they owned the world. The news of Emma's pregnancy had the effect of a cold, sobering shower on the young couple. Howard immediately changed in the face and announced that he wasn't ready to become a father. Moreover, it turned out that he had a rather specific plan for his future, which didn't have a place for Emma and her baby in it. Instead of supporting Emma in this difficult time, Howard suggested that she get an abortion. "Honey, but it's your baby. How can you say that? You swore you loved me and promised to marry me. And now what?" Emma exclaimed with tears in her eyes. But Howard didn't care about her tears. The young man had made up his mind and was on the first flight out to his hometown. Howard knew that his wealthy parents wouldn't accept Emma, who worked as a postwoman and lived with her mother in an old, lopsided house. Upon learning of her daughter's pregnancy, Deborah didn't make a scene or start moralizing. Instead, she walked up to Emma and hugged her, saying, "Don't worry, honey, we'll raise your baby. I love kids and I will help you." Emma looked lovingly at her mother and didn't even realize that her eyes had filled with tears. The young woman felt rather sick throughout the entire pregnancy. Maybe it was because she felt depressed after her breakup with Howard, or maybe it was because the ultrasound showed that she was actually having twins. Fear froze in the young woman's eyes as she imagined how difficult it would be to raise two babies at once. She knew she couldn't really count on her mother's help. Unfortunately, Deborah had recently started complaining of chest pains and felt that her time was about to come. Despite the hard pregnancy, the birth itself was surprisingly easy and almost painless. Looking at two babies, Kevin and Bobby, with tears in her eyes, Emma still couldn't believe that she'd become a mother. This new feeling was so pleasant and unusual that the young woman even briefly forgot about all the problems that had recently befallen her lately. "They're so cute, and they look so much like you," Deborah Yang said, bringing her daughter home from the hospital. Unfortunately, life is often cruel to those who least deserve it. So it happened with Emma's mother. By the will of fate, she didn't get to see her grandkiddos take their first steps or say their first words. Heart problems should never be left untreated, but Deborah Yang had long decided to not seek medical attention. Having buried her mother, Emma realized that there was absolutely no one to help her. For the first time in her life, she was actually all on her own. Since there was simply no one to take care of the babies besides Emma, the young mother couldn't go to work and thus left without an income. Of course, she did get some child benefits, but this money was barely enough to provide Kevin and Bobby with the basics. But there were other things that needed taking care of too. The roof of the house had been leaking for a long time. Whenever it rained, poor Emma had to put out all kinds of buckets and containers to collect the dripping water. Living in such conditions was simply unbearable, especially during fall, when heavy rains could go on for days or even weeks. After yet another of those rainy days, Emma decided to go grocery shopping. As she was leaving her house, she saw her neighbor, who, judging by her appearance, wasn't feeling good. Holding on to her back, the old woman looked at Emma with an expression of unbearable pain in her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Scott. I'm going to the store. Do you need anything?" the young woman asked. Emma hardly ever talked to her neighbor before, but now she changed her mind and decided to be the first one to break the silence. Penelope Scott looked at the young woman and winced at the pain in her back, barely managing to squeeze out, "Can you get me flour, eggs, and butter, please? I want to bake a pie. It's my birthday today, but the damn reticulous won't let me take a step without the unbearable pain." Emma nodded understandingly and hurried off to the store. Having bought everything the old woman had asked for, she threw in a pint of milk, some cheese, and about a pound of ham. Needless to say, Mrs. Scott was delighted with the treats her young neighbor got her. As it turned out later, there was simply no one to help the old woman buy her groceries, so sometimes she didn't have any food at her house at all. "You should come over with the kids in 2 or 3 hours. I'm going to bake a pie. You can warm up at my house. I can see your roof has collapsed and your house is about to fall apart altogether," Mrs. Scott suggested. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. Mrs. Scott was about the only person who'd offered her any help lately. Having gladly accepted her neighbor's invitation, Emma and her sons went over for a visit. The old woman's house was very warm and cozy. Emma and Mrs. Scott got to talking over some tea and apple pie and shared some news from their lives. "You know what? Why don't you and the kids move in with me? I obviously don't have much time left. I'm old, as you have noticed. And what they say about me isn't true. I'm not a witch," the old woman said, taking a sip of tea. Emma's first thought was to refuse the neighbor's offers, but then she remembered her damp and unheated house and changed her mind. "You're probably wondering why people in town don't like your family all that much," Mrs. Scott said. Emma raised an eyebrow questioningly and got ready to listen. "This story dates back to the Great Depression. Your mother's relatives were wealthy farmers, and my great-grandfather worked as their manager." The old woman began with a sad sigh. "Oh, well, I didn't know that. My mother never told me anything about it." Emma gasped. "Of course she didn't tell you, dear. Your ancestors went bankrupt. They owed a lot of money to the local residents who worked on their farm. Angry at the landowners and my great-grandfather, the workers set fire to their estate. The worst part was that Alfred Yang had already taken a loan that day, so he could pay his workers. The money, of course, burned down, as did the owners of the farm. My great-grandfather managed to survive and managed to save the family valuables. Jewelry, golden bars, and family heirlooms," the old woman said, lowering her voice. "So, where are those valuables now?" Emma exclaimed. Mrs. Scott wiped away a tear and then said, "They're buried behind my house. I accidentally found them when I went to plant some flowers. They are yours by right of inheritance. I kept this secret all this time because I didn't have a chance to tell your family. Your mother hated me, but you're different. Dig them up, dear. I'll show you the place." At first, Emma thought that the old woman had lost her mind. But when the young woman picked up a shovel and dug out a heavy box wrapped in oil rags, she immediately changed her mind. Just as Mrs. Scott had said, there were all kinds of jewelry and golden bars inside the box. Emma hugged the old woman and couldn't hold back her tears, promising to take care of her until the end of her days. The young woman kept her promise and provided Mrs. Scott with proper treatment, care, and peace. With the proceeds from selling some of the golden bars, Emma repaired the house and laid the foundation for a new farm that could provide work for everyone in the town. Having thus corrected the mistakes of her family's past, Emma Yang didn't just earn back the respect of the townspeople, but also didn't allow for the honest name of her ancestors, who she was sure were watching her from heaven, to be denigrated.